I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. What if the secret to a high-performing team isn't found in a pep talk or a personality test, but in the cold, hard data of behavioral science? Today, we're joined by Dr. Ron Friedman, an award-winning psychologist and author of the new book, Superteams. We dive into the science-backed strategies that transform a group of individuals into a cohesive powerhouse, challenging the myths of traditional management along the way. My interview with Ron is coming right up, but first, Ron Friedman, welcome to On Brand.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
So we talked about kind of debunking some of these myths along the way. And one of the first ones that jumped out at me, because we talk about communication so much on the show, is, and boy, I feel like there's kind of a web of things that we think are true with all of these great communication tools, but turn out to not be. And you highlight that early on in what you call kind of the hidden costs of constant communication. So why isn't this the great thing that we think it is?
Yeah, this is one of the myths that I bust in Superteams, is the idea that collaboration means constant togetherness. It does not. The most successful collaborators cycle between private, individual focused work and refining ideas as a team. And the mistake that a lot of organizations are making is confusing collaboration with constant togetherness. And so let me paint you a picture. The average worker spends 18 hours a week in meetings. They then lose another 11 hours a week to messages. What does that leave for real work? It's about a day. And what happens when you have to cram a week's worth of work into a single day? You look for ways to create more time. You come in early, you stay late, you work weekends. And that approach can serve you in the short term, but over the long run, it's going to burn you out. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about, hey, how come all these workers are getting burnt out? Well, the better question is, how do they manage to get any work done at all?
That's such a good point. And in addition to hosting the podcast here, I also teach in the MBA program, the professional MBA program. So it's folks out there in the trenches working. And as I read that in your book, I thought of how often I hear people saying, well, if I can just ever actually go and get a chance to do the work that I'm in the meetings about, I'd be great. So what's a better path forward if there's this kind of huge time suck on us as teams?
Yeah. So before I get to the actual strategies, let me take a step back and explain how we did the research and uncovered all of these strategies. Great. So over the last few years, my team and I have gone deep on what high-performing teams do differently. And here's how we did it. We surveyed thousands of workers and asked them two key questions about their teams. The first question is, compared to other teams, how would you rate your team's performance? And how effective is your team at meeting its goals? And then we took the teams with a perfect score on both of those items, a very small group. We call them super teams. They're about 8% of the population. And we looked to see, what are the super teams doing differently? And it's everything. We looked at everything from how they structure their workday to how they run their meetings to even how they recover after work hours and on vacation. So we just kind of put together the playbook of like, here are all the things the super teams are doing differently. So you asked about meetings. That falls into one of the major differences we found in our research, which is that super teams get more done by better managing their time, energy, and attention. And as I mentioned, the average worker loses 3/4 of their week to meetings and messages. Super teams are much more deliberate with their time at the office. They don't make meetings the default. They make meetings the last resort. They're 50% better at avoiding unnecessary meetings. They're 54% less likely to schedule recurring meetings. And recurring meetings are particularly insidious because they're very difficult to remove from your calendar once they're there. It's almost like breaking up with someone. You have to have a difficult conversation about why you don't find your time together valuable anymore. And the other thing they do is they don't just play defense, they also play offense. They protect time in people's calendar to get focused work done during regular work hours. So they'll do things like scheduling dedicated focus blocks of 90 minutes, let's say on a Tuesday afternoon, where everyone is freed from having to monitor their messages, or they'll schedule meeting-free days. But they don't call them meeting-free days. They call them get things done days because they want to reinforce the purpose behind the initiative. The other thing I want to point to, because you asked, how do we free up more time? The other thing that is a strategy that I have really gotten behind after doing this research is meeting guidelines. And meeting guidelines simply involve working together with your team to come up with some rules about what you feel is a good use of a meeting and what you feel is a bad use of a meeting. And in a lot of organizations, meetings just are the default, where you have a question, meeting. You have you want to have a talk about scheduling, meeting. You want to get some ideas, meetings. We need to get clearer on what deserves a meeting and what doesn't. So on my team, we have a very simple rule: no decision, no meeting. Unless there's a decision that needs to be made, we're not going to pull people away from their focus work. If you have a question, that's an email. If you have an update, send us a video capture so you can walk through the Gantt chart and we can talk about it together. Instead of just defaulting to meetings, instead we need to get clearer on what actually moves the ball forward.
That's such a great point. And of the many great tools in the book, you also have the calculation of meeting time based on what the different what the different team members are paid, and it adds up fast. I know I've been in those meetings where you're sitting there quietly thinking, "Oh, geez, this is a lot for a pretty questionable reward." Another thing that that makes me think of is you talk about this idea that I'm sorry, I got lost for a moment there, and
Okay.
this never happens to me, but I am this is really
You get to control this video. You get to edit this out.
I do. So I'm going to. But what I really like about your work makes me think of a dad joke that I find myself saying or referencing, and that is the fact that I think that internally we don't communicate as much about the communication as we should. And you talk about meeting standards, and I feel like we tend to think of it with like tools, like email, Slack, whatever tools that we're using to communicate, but we kind of leave meetings out of that instead of looking at them as really a whole picture for communicating about what our team uses when. And to kind of go further on that, you talked about specificity around meetings, but also specificity around the modes of team communication as well.
Yeah. So if you think about all the tools, all the ways that you can get in touch with your team, it's countless. Like there's texting, email, phone calls. Then there's the comments you can leave in your Google Docs versus Figma if you use that, or Adobe. There are just so many places. And the number keeps multiplying with every new tool that we add. And so simply having some guidelines around where we contact each other when it's important versus when it's not important. And rather than defaulting to people's preferences. Some people just like to text about everything. Some people like to email about everything. And there's just different levels of urgency. And so just having some clear rules and discussions around, okay, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to talk about? So what that does is it frees people up so that when they are doing focused work, they can adapt and still field emergencies. And this is part of the challenge, and why I think that some of the strategies we uncovered in Superteams are so important is because up until now, it's been left up to the individual to find and scavenge for focus time. And so all these productivity tips that we often encounter, like, hey, why don't you batch your email to 3 times a day? Then you'll be able to get more work done. Or turn off your notifications, or put your phone in the other room. What ends up happening when every person adapts their own method of protecting their time is it ends up slowing down the team as a whole. And so what I say in the book is one person's deep work becomes another person's bottleneck. That's what happens when you're working in teams. And so instead of solving this productivity issue on the individual level, the only way to really solve it is to address how we're operating as a team. Because the reality is, it doesn't matter how many productivity tips or hacks or tricks you're using. If your team is not a high performing team, you're going to fall back down to the level of your team. If you're constantly being called into meetings, if you're constantly being pulled away from your work because of messages or phone calls, there's just no way for you to be a top performer.
So another myth that you bust here, and I think is an important one because it's one we hear talked about a lot. There's a lot of debate on return to office and remote versus office versus in office. We think sometimes, I think falsely, to kind of push one of those narratives that we want. That super team can happen anywhere. And I wonder, because I would think, because we talk about that so much, and the assumption would be that, oh, the in-person teams must be the best. But I think virtual teaming is harder, but still possible to be a super team.
Yeah. So one of the questions we asked in our research is, where do you work? What's your work arrangement? And we were able to identify people who work together on their team in office versus people who are fully remote versus hybrid teams. And we look to see, where are the super teams most common? Because there's a lot of debate about where we're most productive. Some studies show we're more productive working from home. Other studies say, well, maybe we're more productive, but actually when it comes to teamwork, that kind of falls apart because you have less trust and weaker communication when people are not together in the same place. And so that's why this question was so interesting to us, is where are the high performing teams most common? And the answer is, it's none of the above. It doesn't matter where you work. And it's because location is not as important as how the team works. You can have everyone be together in an office, but if everyone is spending 2 hours a day commuting into the office just so that they can get to their desk, fire up their laptop and open up Zoom to attend the same phone call they could have attended 2 hours ago from home, that's not going to lead to a high performing team. And so what I say in the book is that there's getting the most out of being in the same location requires intentionality and it requires planning. It's one thing to say everyone needs to be in the office 5 days a week. And it's another to say, look, we're going to trust you to figure out where you work at your best. But on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we're all going to get together for some strategic discussions. So get your pre-reads in on Friday so that everyone can show up prepared and ready to contribute. The latter is taking advantage of what togetherness has to offer, and it requires intentionality and planning.
On Brand will be right back after this. Now, back to the show.
So I want to talk about, I think all of this is fascinating, but it's fascinating and fun because your research has spanned not only corporate boardrooms and workplaces in a variety of settings, but also professional locker rooms, Michelin-starred kitchens, the writer's room of Succession and Bridgerton, as well as, I think this is really interesting in terms of teaming, recording sessions of ABBA and Fleetwood Mac. And I wonder, in looking at such diverse teams, if there's a favorite aha moment that you had along the way.
Do you mean particularly from a team or from the research? Because those are different.
I think on the teams on this one.
Okay. Let me think about it. So Rodgers and Hammerstein are interesting. They're obviously a very productive and successful Broadway arrangement group that put together shows like Oklahoma and so many others that people are familiar with. But what's interesting about them is not only did they not work together all the time, which is the contrast from the constant communication that we talked about, but they worked in completely different states. And so one of them wrote the music, the other one wrote the lyrics, and they combined it later on and completely separately. They'd kind of shipped cassette recordings to one another. And I just think that's so fascinating, and so goes against the way we think about how great ideas are crafted. And it's very similar with ABBA, where ABBA would they basically would work independently. The two male songwriters, Benny and Bjorn, they would write riffs independently, and then they get together to see if they can find combinations that clicked. And once they found a combination that clicked, they built it out into a full-length song. And then they would take it home, and one of them would write the lyrics. Then they'd bring it back to the recording studio, and they'd bring the two singers in, and they would adjust some of the wording to make it easy to sing, and then layer harmonies on top of them. And so the point is, again, it's not constant togetherness, which is the trap we fall into at work when we keep our email and Slack on the entire day. It's the ability to cycle between focus work and then togetherness to refine ideas.
That's a really good point and gets back to that kind of myth busting around in office, which is yet another version of the kind of togetherness, constant togetherness debate. There's an idea early in the book that I found really telling, and I think sometimes it's easy to bring a lot of baggage with us to it, and that's the idea of you call it the Sunday night litmus test. And I think sometimes people have some guilt around that they're not more excited, so it can almost have kind of be a double ding for someone that isn't in a great environment. But I also think that it's that much more powerful for those that are excited. So I wondered if you'd talk us through the Sunday litmus test.
Yeah, so it refers to, how do you feel on Sunday night? Do you feel like you look forward to going into work, or do you kind of dread it? And on the best teams, what we find is they're more than twice as likely to say, I'm excited and looking forward to go to work. Now, that almost sounds so Pollyannish to someone who hates their job. Like, can you really feel that way? And the answer is you can, but it's only when your team does the sorts of things that make it a super team. So we touched a little bit about the first pillar of what differentiates the best teams, and that is they get more done by better managing their time, energy, and attention. The other pillars are, number two, they don't just collaborate well, they actively make one another better. And then the third pillar is they're not satisfied doing great work. They're constantly building their skills and improving over time. So when you are part of a group that empowers you really to do your best work, surrounded by people who make you better, and you have a position where you're constantly growing and learning new things, that's where that excitement comes in. The challenge is creating that kind of environment. And it's not easy. And it's not easy for a variety of reasons. It's not easy because we've been kind of trained to expect to be constantly communicating, number one, in terms of when people feel like they don't really have the ability to get their work done during regular work hours, they're so focused on themselves, they don't have time to worry about making their colleagues better, nor do they have the ability or the bandwidth to start experimenting and trying new things. And so it really kind of all starts with this first domino, I think of it as, is for leaders to learn this skill of focus amplification. How do you amplify people's focus? How do you protect their time, energy, and attention? Because unless you're able to do that, all these other ideas are kind of pie in the sky.
Well, and as you kind of alluded to there, I think another important part of the leader's job is designing an environment for teams to thrive. And you have a lot in here for the leaders who aspire to lead a super team, and there's some different things that you mentioned. I feel like, as folks can see, I have the book with little page flags, which is my love language here, and I feel like a second grade teacher, showing a book at story time. But what I love is that in addition to being chock full of data, you can see it as well. And I think that is pretty compelling. And the one that I had flagged here talks about team leaders excelling at feedback. And feedback is one of those big inflection points in a leader's job, saying the hard thing And we hear a lot about it, and there's a lot of advice about it. But what did you find different about feedback with Superteams?
Well, first, let me just give you some jarring stats. So 97% of feedback fails to improve performance. That's not me saying it. That's decades of research on feedback. 97% of feedback fails to improve performance. Worse, a third of feedback actually worsens performance. So not only does it fail to improve people's performance, they actually take it in a way that leads them to actually get worse over time. So the question is, what's the 3% doing differently? How do you get better at delivering feedback? So first, let me talk about some of the missteps. And this is something that's actually often taught at big organizations. Is for the leader or whoever the person is that's delivering the feedback to say, "Hey, can I give you some feedback?" And I've seen this happen, and I've experienced it. And when you hear that question, you know you're about to get ripped to shreds. And so now, on top of about listening to negative feedback, you feel manipulated because you feel like you had to say yes, not like you're saying, "No, I'm good. I don't need the feedback." Like you say, "Yes, you can give me some feedback." So here's how to do better. And this is something that super leaders are more effective at is number one, focus it on the future, not the past. Don't litigate what the person did wrong. Tell them what they should try in the future. Secondly, don't make it a laundry list of ideas. Focus on one thing at a time, because if you overwhelm people with too much feedback, they shut down. So focus on the future, one thing at a time, and then ideally make it a conversation. And so I might say, Nick, hey, the next time we do an interview, would you consider sending me the questions in advance so I can prepare? Instead of saying, Nick, you didn't send me the questions and of course look like an idiot, right? Now you're going to defend yourself and you're going to say, well, I did, or it didn't make your inbox. Oh, I thought you got it. Oh, I forgot. And that's not productive. And so if you can identify one thing that the person can do in the future, and ideally making a conversation. So I can say, hey, how do you feel about it? Do you think you can send it to me maybe 24 hours in advance? Are you comfortable with that? No longer does it feel like it's demotivating. Now it's like just a way for us to work together and support each other.
That's great, even though I did split my focus between there and say, did he ask me for interview questions? I didn't get them. The point in there that I think is really key that I've heard before is that just like simple, easy, I hesitate to say box to check, but it does feel almost that simple. Can I give you some feedback? And even relabeling that. Do you have any advice on an opening line? Just because starting anything is hard, especially when the stakes are higher. So if you're not saying, got some feedback for you, what might you say?
Why do you need to preface it with anything if you're delivering an idea that's future focused and you're suggesting something that's open to discussion? In other words, I think too much of it is we're stuck in our heads thinking that we're about to do the person a disservice, or we're going to reduce the way that they feel about themselves. And I don't think that's the purpose of feedback at all. It's we're sharing an idea for how we can both improve.
That is a good point, and again, mind blown again with the myth busting. Well, and I think not unlike the productivity tips, I feel like we're to kind of solve the feedback problem or challenge at work. We're given what is the equivalent of productivity tips for difficult conversations, kind of a paint by number approach to how to say the hard thing instead of reframing, which is what you're talking about here, making it future focused, less about blame, more about those teaching moments as well. There are so many great things in here, but I think, the bottom line when it comes to leaders leading super teams, the outcomes that you see, there are, more likely to avoid working on vacations, just some, more likely to receive appreciation from it. It really gets back to not only leading a high performing team, but really, really taking care of your people as well.
Absolutely. And one of the most interesting findings to me is that leaders on super teams are modeling these behaviors themselves. And so an example of that is when a leader says that work-life balance is valued, you can't just say that and then promote the people who work on weekends. It doesn't work. And it teaches people to tune out what you say and focus on what you do, what you actually do. And there's no better indicator of what a culture values than who gets promoted. And if you're looking to build a team that has a strong culture, you have to make sure that your words and your actions align, because if you don't, you're basically undermining trust in a way that's really difficult to recover from. On the point of vacations, I just want to add to this because I feel like this is an important takeaway. A lot of people talk about not working on vacation. And in fact, we found that 39 on Superteams, they're 39% more likely to take work-free vacations. But here's what really jumped out at us is why people choose to work on vacations in the first place. If you ask people on average teams, why are you choosing to work during your vacation? They'll more often than not say because they're worried about coming back to a very full inbox, or they're worried about falling behind or letting their teammates down. And if you ask people on super team, why do you work on vacations? More often than not, they'll say it's because I like to be proactive and I want to contribute. And that's a completely different experience. If you're working on vacation because you're worried about getting back to an inbox full of work, that's draining. But if you're working because you feel like it energizes you and you want to be part of a team, that's positive. And so I think this is why so much of the advice around, hey, everybody needs to disconnect, doesn't really resonate with high performers. It's because not only does not working on their vacation not help their energy, it actually makes them anxious. And so I think instead of just saying, hey, nobody can work during vacations, rather than taking that approach, I think what we really need to look at is why people are choosing to work in the first place. And if they are doing it because it motivates them, that might not be a bad thing. If anything, it might be a sign that they're on a high performing team.
Such a valuable point. And as you were saying that, I was thinking in my past, when I have worked on vacation, I'm like, oh, please don't say that it's the thing of I don't want to come back and be behind. But that's what I found myself saying before. But shake it off. It was a while ago. So I have smiled many times during this conversation. And now, Ron, it is my opportunity to get to ask you for a brand that has made you smile recently.
I have to point to this company called Hyperice. I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with this. This is a company that is, I think, a competitor of Theragun, which is those massage guns that you often see at high-end gyms. And I actually encountered them at my gym where they have a stand. They let you use their equipment. And one of the things that I first used was this vibrating roller, which is really good at relieving tension on your legs. And then just one night, I was like, I like this product so much. I wonder what else they sell. And they sell these basically they look like inflatable pants. You put them on like a pair of pants, you plug them into the wall, and through this inflation process, it massages your legs. And I used to get a lot of soreness after long sessions of swimming or running. I don't get that at all. The next day you're ready to go again. And I'm an evangelist for this company, Hyperice.
I love it. And we talked a bit beforehand. I do some distance running, and those hot pants sound amazing. So I will be looking them up after this. Speaking of looking things up, Ron, where can folks go to learn more about who you are and what you do?
I would recommend people go to a website that we set up that provides some really great tools completely free. It's superteamsmasterclass.com. And I really want to make sure that this research is applicable to people. It's not just a book they read. And so we've created a masterclass that comes with it, as well as a discussion guide you can use to share the best ideas with your team and start implementing some of the insights. So superteamsmasterclass.com, that's a place to go. And obviously you can find me online, Ron Friedman, PhD, and my company is called Superteams Inc. And we do all kinds of keynotes and trainings. And so if we can be helpful, please let me know.
We will link up to all of that in our show notes, which folks can find at onbrandpodcast.com. Ron Friedman, author of Superteams, thanks for being on brand with us.
My pleasure, Nick. Thanks for having me.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.